I like to start my presentations with a little quote, as you saw before. And really, this is about children and the welfare of children, and you know, the different things that the country has done to take care of that problem. So we can go ahead, next slide. I wrote a story several years ago, and I called it A Home in the Country. Many of the children that were sent to St. Michael's came from inner cities and places like that, and I think the idea was to select a place in the country where there was plenty of space, room for expansion and so forth. So that's how St. Michael's came to be in Hopewell. I've collected quite a few images that we're going to show tonight. I wanted to give a little credit for where they came from. The Hopewell Valley Historical Society, which I'm involved in, supplied some of them. Some of the images came from various sources. Some of the images actually came from the Sisters of St. Francis, who were the nuns that actually operated St. Michael's from the day they opened until the day that they closed. And I've also gotten some images, local sources. My friend Bill Frenchue has a wonderful collection of images of Hopewell, and some of the St. Michael's images in my program came from him. And also online, there's a Facebook page for St. Michael's, and some of the images were borrowed from them, and we appreciate being able to use them to sort of tell the story. Okay. Many of us are familiar with this poem. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuge of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I'll lift my lamp beside the golden door. And for me, the key here is that last phrase, beside the golden door. For many who came from Europe and places to America, this was the golden door. This was the place where, you know, they would be able to prosper, they would be able to grow, to be able to raise a family. And so for many, that was the impetus for them to come to America. And of course, the Statue of Liberty was one of the first things they saw. And in 1903, a plaque was created with this poem and put inside the pedestal where it remains today. So I wanted to use this as sort of set the stage for people coming to America and looking for a better life in a better way. And what happened, next one. This is a famous image by American photographer Lewis Hines. And it represents for me this epidemic of orphan children that grew in the inner cities as the 1800s progressed. You know, we were still inventing ourselves as a country. We were developing institutions for education and institutions for running the government, institutions for science, industry. However, the problem of what to do to the children was a difficult situation. And the rate at which children became homeless grew by leaps and bounds. It was really almost an epidemic. And so, you know, as a country, we sought a solution to this problem. Okay. And the problem, this was something that interested me. You know, the problem really was not only orphan children or children without homes, but it also children that came, as you see here, from large families. Families that had financial problems, they had health problems, emotional problems. There were just lots of problems that made it very difficult for families to raise their families, especially when they were large like this. And so the idea of the orphanage came to be, okay? This is such a horrible photograph. 3 little children huddled, sleeping on a grate in New York City, trying to keep warm. without parents. It was a big problem. I really can't stress that enough. So the Catholic Church, along with many other organizations, stepped forward to try to come up with a solution. So they wanted to try and change scenes like this, okay, to scenes like this. I read that in 1900 there were close to 1,000 orphanages in this country. Perhaps 100,000 kids this involved. There were county orphanages, there were Catholic orphanages, Protestant, Jewish, non-sectarian children's home run by private charities. There were a lot of organizations, a lot of groups that were trying to solve the problem. Okay. In the 1880s, the Diocese of Trenton was carved out of the Diocese of Newark, which at that time covered the entire state of New Jersey. The new Diocese of Trenton with Bishop McFarrell that you see here, O'Farrell, excuse me. It comprised of, what I want to say here, 14 counties in the state, covered 2/3 of the area of New Jersey, 35,000 Catholics in a general population of 413,000, and there were 51 priests. So it was a pretty large operation, but the population of Catholics at that time was relatively low compared to what it would become as the 20th century progressed. Okay. In the early 1890s, Bishop O'Farrell envisioned a home for these orphanages that he hoped would solve the problem for the diocese. A smaller one had been created a few years earlier in New Brunswick, St. Mary's, and very quickly it became overcrowded, and the need for a larger, bigger facility with room for expansion became something that the diocese felt needed to be done. So the bishop bought the Peter Van Dyke farm just outside of Hopewell Borough, and it was, let's see, I think about 195 acres at the time, that farm. And you can see here in the center of the screen, P. Van Dyke with the acreage, the driveway in the back. This is Beedens Brook here. And so you can see this is Broad Street. This map is from 1875, a little bit earlier, but it shows the area, it shows the farm. But Bishop O'Farrell never lived to see his dream come to fruition. He died. And in his estate, he earmarked $60,000 for the construction of this home on the farm that had been purchased. Okay. So the second bishop of the Diocese of Trenton, Bishop McFall, recognized the need not only for a home for children, but also a home for indigent and aged people. Both of those were getting to be a problem. The Catholic Church took it upon themselves to come up with a solution for both. And this is one of the interesting connections that I found with this process, is he worked along with Colonel Daniel Morris, who was pretty well known, a Civil War hero and banker in, thank you, Atlantic City. And in his will, he also left a large sum of money to endow the operation of the children's home and also help with its construction, and also the construction of the home that would bear his name, okay? This is the interesting connection for me. I don't know if anyone here remembers Morris Hall that was down in 206 in Lawrenceville. It's now St. Lawrence Rehab. But the original building looked just like this. It was named in honor of Colonel Morris, who also contributed money for that and for St. Michael. So it's an interesting connection. One of the things that was also I thought was interesting is that the Catholic diocese acquired working farms, and they kept them as working farms. When they constructed these large facilities, they remained as working farms, and the residents was not uncommon for them to work in the fields and harvest the crops. And so a lot of the food that was used in Morris Hall and St. Michael's was actually produced on the farms that were there previous to the building of these immense buildings. This is the interesting comparison. If you'll see, this slide changes into St. Michael's, and you can see the connection in the architecture. Very similar, most likely the same architect. I couldn't find that. But this is a very early engraving of a St. Michael's. And as you can see, this is actually the official name, the real name, St. Michael's Orphan, Asylum, and Industrial School, when it was built. It's referred to in a lot of different ways, but that was the actual name that it was. One of the things that Colonel Morris thought that was really important is he thought, and this is a quote, the poor unfortunates, meaning the children, would need a trade. So he stipulated in his will that there would be a training component in St. Michael's, and that's where the industrial school came in. And that would be so that they could receive training, some sort of a trade, so that when they became of the age to where they could leave, they would have some way to earn a living. So there was that training. So the cost of the building at the time was $75,000, and it required a $40,000 endowment to run it. And so that was at the time. Next. This is an aerial photograph that shows the property. This came from my friends at the DNR Greenway. And as you can see, if you go to the next slide, Hopewell is in the background. What I've done is I've turned the actual property into a black and white, just to give you an idea of the size of it. And if you look at the size of this compared to the size of Hopewell, and of course Hopewell goes out this way a little ways, but it's a pretty sizable lot. And so many years later, as we'll talk about at the end, that immense size and acreage became a problem for the citizens of Hopewell and the area. Okay. This shows a little bit here. This is the farm. This is Carter Road, Princeton Avenue, and the orphanage building itself sat right up here. Okay. This is one of the things that I found interesting. A lot of the information that I uncovered came from old Hopewell Heralds. And we had preserved a whole run of Hopewell Herald newspapers that were in the basement where the Herald used to be produced over on Railroad Avenue. When the Packet bought the newspaper, the old Hopewell Valley News, they moved them out of the building, and Ruth Luce, the editor at the time, mentioned to me the old newspapers that were in the basement. And so a group of us went up there, and we were able to get a hold of those old newspapers. It was a stack of probably about this high. And every time the Hopewell Herald was published, weekly from 1880 until 1955, the editor would walk in the basement and throw the recent paper on the table. And so as the years went by, that stack of newspapers became about this tall. So we were able to go up there and save it and bring it out. And a few years later, it was microfilmed by the State Library, part of a big project throughout the country. And ultimately, the newspapers were digitized, and so now we have access to them online. And these papers that we saved from that basement are now available for our research. So a lot of what I found came from scanning through. And back in the old days with microfilm, you had to kind of wind it through and hope you would see, you know. And now you just simply would type in St. Michael's Orphanage and any variety of things, and up pops numerous. Every single time St. Michael's was mentioned over all of those years, it would come up on this search. So that's where a lot of it came from. This was one of the things that really caught my attention. One of the wonderful things I think about history is that we get a chance to use our imagination. We get to think about things that used to be. I'm particularly fascinated with things that used to be somewhere that are no longer, such as St. Michael's. I remember visiting my grandparents and riding by this immense building, and then it disappeared. And so I was curious, as I am with a lot of things in history, what did it look like, what took place there? And this to me was really fascinating to try and imagine, and those of you who live in town or work in town or familiar with the town, try to imagine a crowd of 10,000 people. And they were not here for the building opening, they were here just for the laying of the cornerstone and the first shovel. I find it interesting to try to imagine a bishop with a shovel. Probably the only time you would ever see that. But it was a big thing. It was a huge, huge celebration. And you can see, okay, go ahead. In the newspaper, it talked about 32 special train cars came from Trenton. 32. Try to imagine that number of people arriving at the station. Try to imagine the commotion that would take. 13 from Perth Amboy, countless carriages and wagons. People from miles and miles away came for this event. And they all would gather at the train station, and they would make their way up through here and off to the site. Okay? It must have been a crazy, boisterous, loud commotion that day. And then, of course, all 10,000 people all had to go back, get back on the trains and get out of town. I found an interesting quote in the Trenton Times, and it said of this, "The demonstration undoubtedly excelled anything Sleepy Hopewell had ever witnessed." Okay. So what did that mean? A parade that included over 3,000 men lined up at the train station. This is a wonderful sort of 1910-ish image of the train station you see here, and the beautiful grounds. Everything was beautifully landscaped. They would send a crew up, I read, in the springtime, and they would plant flowers, and they would weed all the beds, and they would get everything ready. And you can see, you could just imagine how beautiful that train station area must have looked at that time. And so this is the location. And so they marched from the train station up to the site. Here's an interesting picture that I like to envision. It said in the paper, "The priests vested themselves in a small tool shed before they marched out onto the platform." Just trying to imagine these bishops of this huge diocese putting on their things in a little tool shed in a field with 10,000 people standing there waiting. It was just amazing. And I think also for me, it shows the importance that St. Michael's had not only in Hopewell, but also in the greater community within the state. It was a huge deal. Okay. Yeah, they talked about orchestras playing, choirs singing, and long speeches talking about the importance of taking care of children and all of the plans and all of the things that they plan to do with St. Michael's. This is an interesting photograph. I had looked at it before, but never really understood what it was. There was a publication printed here in town that was called Healthful Historic Hopewell. And it was pretty much a promotional brochure. It had a lot of photographs of the homes in town and the banks. It was published by the Calvary Baptist Church over here. Presumably people would send this to friends and family to promote Hopewell and say, sell your house and come to Hopewell. It's a wonderful place. This photograph was included in that, dated 1897. And as you can see, the building is still under construction. Some of the spots you can see right through, the windows weren't put in. The ladders were still here. The front entranceway was not on. You know, and it's easy to imagine this was an immense structure. I can't think of any other building in Hopewell Valley that was anywhere close in size to this, with the exception of the Pennington School. If you think about the size of that building on West Delaware Avenue and this one, I still think that this one was probably far more immense in size. And also, if you think about it, you look at old photos, and there were very few trees back in those days. People had cut them down for whatever reason. So you would have been able to see St. Michael's from miles and miles away. It was huge. Okay. So this was a photograph, interestingly enough, that the Historical Society had in a collection of theirs. And it was the Frisbee family collection. And it was a group of probably 700 photographs that we were able to preserve and put into our collection. And there was one photograph in that Frisbee collection of St. Michael's, which is this one. It's been used many times. And it's interesting. You can see that it's freshly made. You can see the wagon. And the thing that interested me was this little canopy that looked there. And we wondered, was this opening day? We really didn't know. I found an account in the newspaper. And they were trying to give an idea of the size and the importance of it. And in the description, they talked about the marching bands, the choirs, the drum and bugle corps from all over the state. And in it, now this is the dedication after the building has been up, and in it they describe this special canopy and the flag on the front of the building. So based on that newspaper account, we were able to in fact, confirmed that this was opening day, and that's the only time that that canopy was there. So it's an interesting way to do cross research from one to the other to give you an answer on when a photograph could have been taken. I was excited to find that and make that connection. One of the things that fascinates me and makes me curious, this is a detail of the top of the building. And as I've done my research and looked at this building countless times and tried to imagine, I tried to imagine what was in that top floor. What was that up there? You know, was this a special room? Was that where the head sister stayed? I really don't know, but I'm just fascinated to try and imagine what that must have looked like, and also, more importantly, what the view out the top of that building from those upper floors must have looked like way back at that time period. So maybe someday I'll find out, or someone who was there somehow made it to the top floor and could describe it to me, but I'm just fascinated. Okay. So here's a little bit better of a view. This is one of the images that came from the Sisters of St. Francis, who ran St. Michael's the entire time. They also ran Morris Hall from its construction in the early 1900s all the way up until 1981. And so they spoke to the archivist out there, and she was nice enough to send me some images, and this is one of them. I'd never really seen it. The building is done, the property is landscaped, the water tower is in the back. One of the things that I found really interesting to me is I read that at any given time, no more than 10 or 20%, according to the source, no more than 10 or 20% of the children housed in these places, like St. Michael's, were actually really orphaned. So there were many children who were there that did not have parents, but there were also quite a few orphans that came from those families with difficulties, financial. It was not always a good situation. There might be, the state would find that the parents were not fit to take care of their children, and they would send them here. I read an account that for me was really very touching in this whole process. And it described a man who had 9 children, and his wife died. And he just somehow knew that it would be impossible for him to take care of these children. It would be impossible for him to work and take care of that. So he put his 9 children in a car, drove to Hopewell, pulled up to the front gate, went into the front, had a few words with the nuns. The 9 children got out of the car, took what they thought was a tour. The father got back in the car and drove away. And that was it. And I'm sure that happened many, many, many times. And very often, from what I read, the parents would come back. Sometimes the situation would change, or their health would get better, or they would get a job, and the parents might come back and take them. Not always. And very often, the parents were able to visit on weekends, different things like that. But there were lots of stories. Stories of children that had difficult times, and stories I've read of children that had a wonderful time. If it's hard to believe. People that went on to be success and would come back year after year, would bring presents for the orphans because they had once been, and they felt that that was how they were able to go on in life because of this, because of the horrible experience they had had at home, whatever it happened to be. So they would come back. So there's a lot of stories here. One of the things that happened almost right away is they ran out of space. They needed more room. They needed to accommodate more children. So one of the benefits of being on a large farm is they had lots of space. They had lots of land that they could build on. So in 1905, the newspaper announced that a chapel would be built, and it would form a T from the original building. So the chapel was built in the center section in the back and went into the back. The newspapers give quite a bit of description about this chapel. It talks about underneath of the chapel was a large dining hall and a reception hall for visiting parents. And they also mentioned a new engine room and a most up-to-date modern steam laundry. So it was always growing. It was always expanding. It's interesting for me to take note of the population at St. Michael's at different times and sort of make connections to the economy and the country in general. And of course, the highest population of St. Michael's, 418 children, had a capacity of 450. 418 children in 1944. So what does that tell you? Okay. Another interesting aspect of it was the incredible numbers of babies that the state would send for whatever reason to St. Michael's. So by 1914, in an effort to handle this just exploding population of babies, they built an addition off of the north end, which is right here. And you can see, I mean, look at the size of it. It's huge. And this is what the newspapers refer to as the baby building. So that gives you kind of an idea of the difficulties at that time with societies and small babies. So it was also referred to as the girls' wing. It had additional rooms for the girls at that end. Next. This is, for me, is one of the stranger photographs that we've uncovered on St. Michael's. As you can see, the children, the boys lined up on the left. This is the driveway into the front, obviously. You can see the new addition here. It helps us date it a little bit. And the girls on the right. Particularly interested at the expression of this nun in the front with her mouth wide open. You just try to imagine what was going on. Some of the special events that took place later on, and I'll talk about briefly, and this may very possibly have been for the arrival of a very important guest. But it's just an unusual photo. Next. This is a newspaper photograph, an article that found in the Trenton Times. And so in 1931, 2 years into the Depression, the board of directors of St. Michael's, and that's how it was run. There were a board of directors that oversaw the welfare of the children coming and going. That's the placement and also a finding of foster homes and places for the children once they became of age. So again, right after the Depression, right in the midst of the Depression, right after the crash of '29, they felt it necessary. And so another huge addition was built at the far end of the building, and that was referred to as the boys' wing. Okay? This is a photograph, again, that came from the nuns. It's interesting to really look at, as a group, the content of the photographs from the nuns. There was a publication that they sent to me, and I'm pretty sure that some of these photographs were used in that publication for promotional reasons. But it almost has a park-like quality to it, with the landscaping and the grand sweeping front driveway and all of that sort of thing. Next. And this shows the front of the building, the entranceway. You can see the nuns there in the front, clearly discussing the welfare of children or something, whatever they were. The book, I think, was used for fundraising. They were constantly running out of money. They were constantly underfunded. I read stories of, nuns, their only transportation was a horse and buggy. And so if anything was needed, they'd have to hitch this thing up and go into town or go somewhere. They were constantly looking for money. They were looking for help from the community. And so I imagine that that's what some of these promotional photographs were created for. Okay? This came from the St. Michael's Facebook page. They were posted there by people that went and using them to just sort of demonstrate the size and the amount of construction. This one I date probably from the 1970s. You could see a car in the next image, okay? But you just get an idea of the size and the scale, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the funds the cost of running it was just getting so great, it just became a huge burden. And also at the same time, they were discovering that this really wasn't the best way of dealing with it. It reminded me of the phrase that we're hearing this year about national parks. And these huge institutions to take care of children were not America's best idea. And it took them a while to figure this out. And the building got bigger and bigger as the decades went by until it finally got to be a financial problem and also just not the right thing to do with children. Okay? Clearly a promotional photograph. This came from the Sisters of St. Francis. I have been able to locate very few photographs of the inside of the building. This shows clearly the dining hall, and you can see all the places set and everything is neat, and the napkins are rolled all nicely. And so clearly this was meant for promotional purposes. I'm not sure that the dining hall did not always look like this. It was not always so neatly set. One of the interesting things, and I just bring it up here, that I found in the newspaper and also in some of the dedication booklets from the Sisters of St. Francis, mentioning and showing gratitude for Dr. Pearson, who was one of the doctors here in Hopewell for many years, was the mayor once, maybe twice, very prominent in town. And he was also the only doctor, and he served the children of St. Michael's for 50 years, from the day they opened. For 50 years. And he would come out anytime, a night or day, when the nuns would call to help them take care of the children. So, it talks a little bit about the interaction between St. Michael's and the community. People have asked, was there any interaction? And there was, particularly early on. Okay. This was, again, from the nuns, the gardens in the front. And I've been told from reliable sources that this was referred to as the grotto. And you see a young lady there in her Sunday finest. So this was on the grounds. This is a wider shot a little bit later on, and we'll come back to this later. Okay, next. And then next again. These are also from the Facebook pages, clearly into the 70s. It's the fall. This is sort of what I remember riding by to visit my grandparents, this huge building looming there. See the flagpole. Next. And it really had a sort of a park-like atmosphere right up until the end, okay? Just really want to give everyone an idea of what it looked like. I didn't go there. I know that many of you in the audience did go there. Different things had different purposes, the grotto and so on and so forth. Just really trying to collect images and give people something to fix in their mind. This was a huge memorial in the front to Colonel Morris that was also on the grounds, who dedicated a large amount of the funds for its construction and also the operating funds. And this monument, as all of the other ones, and including the graves, when the facility closed down in 1973, all of these things were relocated. And this is at St. Mary's in Trenton, I believe. I got some information from a foundation that works in honor of Colonel Morris. Okay? So here is the photograph of the Sisters of St. Francis, and just outside of Philadelphia. They're still there. They're still operating. And I just dialed them up cold. And I said, do you have an archivist? And they said, yes. And Sister Helen came on. And we had a very nice conversation. I told her what I was doing, and she said, I will send you some things. And in a flash, these came through. Okay. This is an interesting photograph. As we'll get to in a little while, a few minutes, there was a farm on the property. And the farm family we contacted at the time, we were trying to raise funds to preserve it. And so this came from the Murphy-Cleveget family archives. They were the farmers. Just sort of a cute little photograph. And again, you don't know why the nuns always have those looks on their faces. Just all of the nun photographs, it seems, they have those looks on their faces. I'm sure they were disapproving of something that someone was doing, or some face or something, I don't know. Okay. And these are some of the images that the nuns sent. And again, this is what I would call a promotional photograph. You can see the children all dressed up in these wonderful Sunday clothes. I'm sure it was all for the photograph. Outside playing, having fun, okay? It's just interesting when you compare the group of photographs from the nuns to other groups of photographs that you can see what they saved and what they wanted out there. And so here are the girls, having fun outside, doing what children do. And they would use these promotional books to send out to solicit funds to help offset the operation, okay? I'm pretty sure that the children did not look this way every single day. I think it was all for the photograph, okay? Special events, we came across a lot of articles in the newspaper about some of the fun things that the children were able to do. And one of them, this is a pavilion out in the back. They were all lining up here. You can see in their fine clothes getting ready to go on a trip. And one of the trips that they took, which I thought was sort of interesting next, Quite a bit of mention of it in the Trenton papers and the Hopewell papers. The children en route from the home for a river outing. And so the outing was they arranged for special trolleys to be sent to Hopewell. It was all sponsored by the Trenton Times newspaper, and they took the children from St. Michael's and a couple other children's groups in the Trenton area and brought them by trolley down to the river, okay? And they all boarded the steamer Columbia at the docks in Trenton and went down for a day of fun at a place called Burlington Island. I don't know if any of you ever heard of it. I did a little research and it's pretty amazing what was there. There's nothing there now except for the island. But the article, it's sort of interesting when you read, this is a quote from the Trenton Times in the article that you see here. Next. There may be hard knocks and cruel jostling from the world that does not care. But in spite of this, there will be fond memories in the minds of 400 tots. This is my favorite. Of one perfectly happy day when they sailed down the beautiful river to an enchanted island. What can I say? These articles, when you read these articles, it's just really interesting to read the wording and try to get an idea of the events. There were other excursions that went on, okay? This is another one from the Murphy-Cloutier family that they allowed us to use, and it's obviously a fishing outing. And this was on Model Avenue. This is Model Avenue here. You can see a little pond there, and the boys all with their poles, you know. So there was a lot of interaction. There were groups of people in the borough that would make this happen. They would go out with their vehicles or their cars and bring the kids into town, and there was quite a bit of interaction over the years, trying to give these children some semblance of normalcy, which was hard to do in an institution like that, but you know, they did try, and a lot of these kids, you know, were able to experience Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. I talked with Bev Weidel the other day, who's the curator, as you know, at the Hopewell Museum, and she remembers back in the 50s or 60s as a Girl Scout leader that they would have Girl Scout meetings, and she said invariably at the time of the meeting, a few little girls from the orphanage would show up. They would participate in the activities of the local Girl Scout troop. And then Bev would put them in her car and she would drive them back up to the front of the orphanage and turn them back over to the nuns. And this would happen week after week. So it's interesting to just read about these connections between the community. And next. St. Michael's had its own baseball team. They tried all sorts of things, again, to try to give them some sense of normalcy in the midst of this, you know, very difficult world that many of these children had come from. Okay? This is an interesting special guest. There were special guests that came from time to time. And of course, this is very dated. Jack Dempsey at one time was the world's heavyweight champion. Very popular. Very well known, everybody knew the champ. And lo and behold, one day, I couldn't really find out why or what the connection, but Jack Dempsey himself visited St. Michael's, okay? And you can see here, Jack Dempsey receives local greeting. Former heavyweight fight champion visits St. Michael's. Distributes candy to the children. So it describes in that article the children lining up in the front semicircle for his visit. So the photograph that we looked at before very well could have been for this big visit. It's really interesting reading the, go ahead the next, reading the accounts, but here's the champ swinging in there. And you can imagine there were local spectators and all sorts of people there. And They talk about Jack Dempsey showing up in a big open touring car as he whirled in the driveway. And the newspaper says that he was accompanied by his promoter, Jerry the Greek, and a plainclothes officer, Sharky Kelly. So you can just imagine that scene. You can just imagine, in the midst of the 30, this happening to these children at the orphanage, this famous man coming up with his Jerry the Greek and Sharky. But he mounted the stairs to an adoring crowd and stated to the children, and I quote, "Success depends on clean living, no smoking, drinking, be obedient, and pay attention to those in charge," as it said. It didn't say listen to your parents, those in charge, the newspaper article. So before he left, he shook the hands of every single orphan, gave each of them a piece of candy, and then they went out into their big machine and whisked away. So it's just interesting to see these different events, different things that took place between the community and at St. Michael's over the course of those 75 years, okay? By far the most interesting story, and it's really a story within a story, of St. Michael's was the St. Michael's Orphanage Band. And it's really an amazing story when you start to read. It was formed in the 1920s by Father Kelly, which is pictured here in the background. These were all orphans. The band equipment, the band uniforms were all donated by various sources and special interest groups. And the band grew in popularity, and it grew until it was the favorite performer and supplied music for virtually every special event that took place in Hopewell at the time. And then they went on to larger venues and out across the state, okay? St. Michael's Orphanage Band makes its debut on Keith's Circuit. Dine with the governor. It's interesting, this is a quote from the newspaper in this article. As the governor entered the dining room, he was lustily greeted by 30 lads clad in West Point uniforms. He passed amongst them, called each by their name, for he knows every one of them, and wished each lad a happy new year. So that was a pretty big deal, okay? Here's a later photograph. This appeared in a 1924 postcard, and it's now officially called St. Michael's Orphanage Band, okay? And they grew and grew in popularity until it got to the point where if you wanted to book St. Michael's Band for your event, you had to book them way, I'm talking 6 months in advance, okay? I think this is a little much of a boast. Orphanage Band wins world fame. However, it did become nationally known. It was reported in papers. After all, it was pretty amazing. One of the interesting side things is you see here some of the members of the musical organization received tempting offers. So they would go out to play and people would see them and they say, "Oh, such a wonderful young boy, I'd like to adopt them." And so the problem became, well, if we lose children in the band, we lose the band. So the thing that was interesting is most of the boys said, "No, I want to stay in the band, and I want to, be part of this." And of course, the thing that was interesting, and I found this a little bit later on, that as they were playing and as they were being booked in all of these places across the state, including New York City, the payment went right to the operation. Of course, the kids didn't get any of the money, but it supplied quite a bit of income to the orphanage. Next. This was an interesting one, 1924, Orphanage Band to play Saturday night. It apparently in the spring of 1924, And I think this is really interesting in light of this community and what it does today is a lot of activities. There's a lot of things going, like this theater here. So they talked about, at that time, they organized what was called a music week. And all during the week, there were bands and choirs at one church and the next church, and then they would be here, and then they would be there. So the citizens had all of these different venues and programs to attend during that week. All this sort of cultural going on, I thought was really fascinating. And then, of course, the culmination of the big week, the big celebration, was the Saturday night concert by St. Michael's Band. And the newspaper describes how the band set up in the center in Broad Street and Greenwood Avenue, and that the crowds lined both sides of the street, all the way from Blackwell to hundreds of feet south, west of Greenwood. The crowds were packed, waiting to get a chance to see the band. And they said the machines, meaning the cars, were parked for blocks in either direction as people came from all parts of the valley to witness this. And my understanding is the band was very moving. They were not just good, they were really good. And people were amazed at the performances and the way that these young boys had a master of their instruments at such a young age. It was really quite a phenomenon. Okay. So then we go all the way up to 1934. This is 10 years later, and they're still at it. So it was a big thing. It didn't last forever, I think a few more years, and then Father Kelly, I think, retired, and that was the end of it. But it was a big time for a lot of the kids out there. Okay. And of course, I know there are several in this audience who I happen to know very well that attended a parochial school out at St. Michael's. So they were called the townies, the town kids. And the parents would send them to St. Michael's for their elementary education. And so here's a photograph that, again, I found on the website, 1932, graduation day. And this is, of course, the front steps. So these were presumably town children or non-residents on a graduation day. Next. 1937, the same thing, graduation day. You see all the young people have their little diplomas, and the nuns standing there beside them, all proud as they could be. Next. Fast forward, 1967, still at it. This came from my friend Jim Devlin just the other day, dug it out of his personal family archives. Next. But it really gives the size of the building, and there he is on the left, proud as can be. Little Jimmy. It looks like his sister has fallen asleep there, I don't know. But again, it just shows the continuation of this community connection between St. Michael's and Hopewell Borough, okay? Country air, I just talk about this for many of these children from inner cities that had lived in pretty bad situations. To be able to come out and live on a farm was a very different environment. Okay? These are some of the shots of the orphans. These again came from the St. Michael's Facebook page, and I thank them for allowing me to share them with everybody. Girls playing baseball, you see the fields there in the back. So there was a lot of outdoor activities. Okay? Baseball. You see the farmland there in the background. We'll talk about that in a second. Next. Riding the bicycles. I found lots of accounts where organizations in Trenton and places like that would raise money to buy bicycles for the kids at St. Michael's, and they would bring them out. They would have an opportunity to ride around in the back with these donations. They were really dependent on these extra things from these special groups to give them the money. Okay? The playground equipment, again, later, this is back in the 70s, things are starting to grow a little old and the swing sets are starting to deteriorate. Things are starting to run down. It's becoming increasingly difficult to run something of this size, okay? Another shot, but it shows the farm. Yeah. Next. So the farm. We just talk about this briefly, okay? We talked about how these were working farms, okay? This is a 1948 aerial shot. Click, okay? And you look in the back right, and there was the farm. It was a working farm. They had as many as 300 acres in cultivation at various times. Next. And these photographs came from the farm family that lived there. This was the farmhouse. I don't remember the farmhouse. I don't know when it came down, but this is a shot of the farmhouse, okay? And this is Mr. and Mrs. Murphy, who were actually orphans at St. Michael's. They met at St. Michael's. They got married and went on to run the farm, raise their family there. During the effort to preserve St. Michael's, when we were at the DNR Greenway, members of the family came forward. There, an article had appeared that said that the orphanage had closed and that the land sat dormant for all those years and nothing happened. In response to that comment, a member of the Murphy-Cloutier family contacted us and said, oh no, it was a working farm, it was a large dairy farm, and even after St. Michael's closed, the family continued. This woman that contacted us, her father was a farmer, and along with Mr. Eichinger, some of you may know, worked that farm for many years. Very fertile land, and so this is some of the shots that the family shared with us of the farm, okay? And this is the kids on the farm. My understanding is this young lady went on to marry Frank Cloutier and raised her family on the farm. And along with a cousin, they managed the farm for many, many years. Okay? This is a shot that was in there that just sort of appealed to me from a photographic standpoint. Not the type of photograph you would typically see in the 30s, but just a random shot out of a second-story window. And you can see Dad and the boys sitting here on the running board of their 38 Ford or some such, talking, getting ready, another car in the background here, and the farm wagon. Just shows you just a sort of a slice of farm life on the St. Michael's farm, okay? And again, these were farm hands. It was very, it was hard work. It was a big farm. There was a lot going on. I'm going to see here the facts and figures on the farm sort of surprised me. It was a first-class dairy operation. They had 60 cows, 40 sheep, and 4,000 chickens. That's a lot, okay? I'm not a farmer, but that seems like a lot to me. Next. So there were a lot of shots of working the farm that are really fun to look at. Old horse-drawn piece of farm equipment here. This is probably, again, from that same 30s time period. Next. And this is a working shot. You see now we have a gasoline-powered tractor and the farm hands up on the hay wagon there. It's just interesting that they took the time to make these photographs. Next. This is one of my favorite family portraits up on the top. It's just a great shot. And the woman that contacted us was very emotional about her family's connection to the land and the farm, and that they had spent their entire lives working hard, and the kids pitched in, and even the orphans at times would go out to the farm and help out, do different things. I even read a comment by a woman who lived in town here, and she said on the weekends sometimes for fun she would go out and work on the farm and help with the chickens and do different things because she thought that was fun. So again, next. So this is the aerial shot. By 1948 the population was at 200, and the idea of foster homes was starting to be the next best solution for the destitute children of the diocese. By 1955, they discontinued sending orphans to St. Michael's. And at the time of its closing in 1973, there were just 56 residents. So you think about that, from a high in 1944 of 418 to just 56. The time for massive institutions to house children was now past, thankfully. The placement of kids into normal home settings, foster homes, was deemed the best way to prepare them for adulthood. Next. Okay. So the building, as you know, was demolished. It was taken down. Any signs of the former goings-on were removed. The monuments, the graves, the gravestones, the statues, some of them were removed. Next. And I have an interesting quote from a woman that I got just last week. She said, "I worked there from 1969 until it closed in 1973. At that time, the school had been closed for some time. The facility was capable of housing several hundred children, but at the time there were just 65, and I had 17 mentally and physically challenged children in my area." This was at the time of the closing. "And my handicapped children were placed in institutions in several states." It was her statement. So in the end, the estimated cost of repairing the building were temporary repairs were $1 million. Next. This is the remains, one of the only above ground remains that still stand. Next. You can get an idea of what that was. And you can see just over here, just a little bit of that fence. By 1968, the cost of running the home was $150,000 a year, and they were running a $21,000 deficit. By 1972, the year before they closed, they were spending $420,000 a year to run the place. And there were, at full bore, there were 22 nuns there, and when they closed, they had 33 lay workers. So that's quite a staff, 11 nuns and 33. And the deficit in 1973 was $200,000. And at that point, the diocese just said, that's it, it's enough. Next. So many of you remember the land sat vacant after the farming operation stopped, and the lanes were still there, and many of us walked and hiked there. I remember trespassing on the diocese property many times with my children when they were young, riding bicycles, and it was sort of a mysterious place. Next. And everything was deteriorating, and everything was just sitting there while the diocese pondered what they were going to do. However, the problem became very apparent, that vacant land at St. Michael's could turn from what you see here until what you see next. Go ahead. So we estimated at the time that the potential for that land would have doubled the number of houses in Hopewell. That you could have fit 1,000 homes out there. And the threat to this community, the threat of the change, the threat of losing its small town character was more than people could really bear. The DNR Greenway stepped in, and an offer was made to buy the land. Go ahead. And this was one of their plots from the time, so this is 2008. You can see here the land and some of the plans they had and the fundraising. Many of you here probably remember were involved. There were parties, there were dances, there were all sorts of fundraising things. We even remember there was a little young girl that went door to door with a little container and collected coins to preserve St. Michael's. It was quite an event. It was quite a time. I remember it clearly. An interesting thing that I just recently found out and that I will point out, if you look at this map, you can see this little section here in the front. And that's where the diocese, the St. Michael's building, that little block was not sold by the diocese, was not part of this, and the Diocese of Trenton still owns that. So many of us thought that the whole thing was preserved, but that's not really the case. Next. You can see the fundraising event even made it into the New York Times, talking about the deadline the diocese have put in place for the Greenway to raise the money. It was a big push. It was a push to the end. Deals were made, and local partners were the state government and the county government and local government, all of these people putting money together to buy this land. And when all was said and done, about $3 million had to be raised by private funds. So I can remember the last couple of days working out at the Greenway from their offices over there, and people just coming through the doors with envelopes and checks and money. You know, I remember somebody came in and was in a big hurry. They gave me an unmarked envelope and they said, "Here, give this." And inside the envelope was a donation of $1,000. And they just wanted this land to be saved. It was really something. If you all that were here at that time can remember, it was quite a feat. And the community really came forward to make this happen. And it was just a very special time, okay? So here's the land today. I was fascinated to learn that one of the important applications for drones will be surveying open space, open lands, looking it over. So these shots were taken, I just got these recently from the DNR Greenway. And they hired a man to come in with a drone and photograph. So this is the front lot where St. Michael's, this is Princeton Road. Here's the new parking lot. Here's the site of the old farm. Next. It's a wonderful piece of property. And despite the fact that there were a lot of difficult times for people at St. Michael's in the orphanage, there's a lot of mixed emotions. Some people feel one way strongly, the other. You know, the land has come, you know, it's a happy ending, I think. It's a very special ending for the community to have this as a facility, and it's very exciting. The plans that the DNR Greenway has, some of the things that have taken place there, of course. Next. This is a wonderful spot, and if you have not visited here, I would strongly recommend that you do it. Called the Charles Evans Overlook. It's a wonderful spot. You can hike there from the parking lot, or you can go over and approach it from Aunt Molly Road. You go up a pretty steep incline and you come out, and it's just a beautiful place to come sit and ponder the beautiful community that sits nestled in the valley there. Okay, next. Well, this is the view from up there. You see the old barn and the community steeple from St. Alphonsus. And I would suggest that if you go up there and you sit there long enough and look at that silo for long enough, you might realize that for some reason that silo is twice as tall as it really needs to be. And you might be able to figure out why that is if you sit up there long enough. Okay, next. Lots of exciting things. This is one of my favorites, the campouts. I spent a lot of time camping as a boy, and I think it's something that a lot of young people today don't have the opportunity. So they've had a couple campouts. So this is a shot that I got from the Greenway, and kids loading their sticks with marshmallows and a fire about to be lit. Okay, next. The camp out. This is a view from inside a tent. And I just think that's such a wonderful thing. I think it's a wonderful thing for kids and families to be able to do together right here in their own community. Camp out. There's nothing like waking up a tent early in the morning. Maybe the smell of the fire and making your food and so forth. Next. Even concerts. This happened just recently, part of the 125 celebration. The operation of, I don't know how many bands were there ultimately, but it was quite a night. Lots of band, lots of excitement, lots of goings on, you know. So it continues to be a wonderful resource for the community. Next. And this is my last slide, and this is the thing that really appeals to me the most, was just the benefit for the children, the next generation coming up, to have this nature preserve almost directly across from the school. Ways to get out and walk and understand and learn about nature, and most importantly, to learn why it's important to preserve nature and to preserve the planet and the environment. So it's really a wonderful opportunity for the community. It's a long history, but it's a history that now will continue on. Okay? Thank you all. Thank you.